Karl Marx is the most important philosopher from the past 300 years. This is not to say that he's the most intelligent, the most perceptive, or even the most profound. Rather, Marx's critiques and proposed remedies of modern society are a turning point in history, identifying what is called the modern age. He is to modern society what St. Augustine is to Christianity, yet Marx signals a turn away from religion and instead calls us, in our quest towards a meaningful life, to reform society. Marx is the chief architect of all subsequent social and political philosophies, and is prophetic in his anticipation of the widespread feelings of meaninglessness and depression that define our times. It is sometimes difficult to know why one philosopher is remembered and another forgotten. Who decides what qualifies someone as a philosopher? Marx himself claims that history is written by the victors, and thus, most of the things that we qualify as philosophy are reflections of the values of the current dominant culture. In other words, most things that are considered philosophically profound are usually white, or reflect the values of modern white culture. But besides essentially creating the values of modern white culture, Marx is also remembered historically as providing the slogans and philosophy behind most 20th century social revolutions, including the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, and the Cultural Revolution in China. Marxism even played a significant role in the Iranian Revolution in 1979, though the role and subsequent popularity of the Marxists was diminished by the group of clerics who now govern the Islamic Republic of Iran. Thus, on a global scale, there is no single philosopher who has inspired more hope or hatred than Marx. Yet in his own life, Marx and his ideas were unknown and overlooked outside of a small circle of people. Born in 1818 and educated in Germany, Marx spent his life trying to overthrow and revolutionize governments, and thus was a political refugee, kicked out of Germany, Belgium, and France, eventually settling in London, the city at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. When he died several years before the first English translations of his Communist Manifesto, it is estimated that a total of 9 people attended his funeral. Marx didn't work much and, unable to make a living through his writings, was financially supported by his very good friend Frederick Engels. Marx married a woman named Jenny, whom he apparently adored since he had 3 daughters with her, all of whom he named Jenny. Yet against the background of this unsuccessful and mediocre life lived a very troubled man, and Marx was troubled for reasons that should continue to disturb us. In his early 30s, Frederick Engels showed Marx how the industrialization of society affected the working conditions of modernized Europe. Marx was so bothered by what Engels revealed to him that Marx devoted the rest of his life to understanding how the emotional traumas of the modern world echo throughout every corner of society. Each philosopher has their own unique form of writing, and the form of the philosophy generally reflects the core of the philosophy. For example, Plato uses the Greek form of plays, which emphasizes the relationship between student and teacher, and Rumi, the Persian philosopher, uses Persian poetry, which highlights the emotional qualities of love and separation. Since Marx was a social reformer, a philosophical approach that is only as successful as it is popular, early in his career Marx summarized his core philosophy, had it translated into many languages, and distributed it. This style of writing is called a manifesto. Marx saw that the modern world was creating emotionally isolated and alienated people, and the movement that emphasized communities is called communism. Published in 1848, the Communist Manifesto is the easiest way to understand Marx, and the easiest way to examine the emotional impact of modern society. The opening lines of any philosophical work convey the essence of the work, and usually the rest of the work is merely commentary upon the first line. The Communist Manifesto opens with the line, "The history of all previous society is the history of class struggles." This opening sentence, the essence of Marx's philosophy, is unique because Marx argues that the main struggle of human life is rooted in the nature of society. Prior to this, the struggles and problems of human life were rooted, or at least considered to be rooted, in the nature of human being, primarily the conflict between soul and body. Though one part of us, our soul, struggles to live a life characterized by love, justice, and virtue, our soul is constantly being pulled back to earth by the desires of the body, such as comfort, power, and laziness. For example, Socrates conceived of the body as a cage of the soul, and the cessation of physical life, i.e., death, was a gift for those who had lived good lives. In contrast, Marx argues that society is the origin of human struggle. With this, along with Emil Durkheim and Max Weber, Marx creates the field of sociology, which for the first time argues that in modern times, society has become so sick that it no longer supports a meaningful struggle between soul and body. Though Marx's diagnoses are all the more appealing because of their continued relevance, it's also worth noting the events that caused Marx to reform the very structure of society. The continued interest in reforming social systems, whether it's systematic racism, institutionalized patriarchy, or the corporatization of the jail system, points to the fact that the core social problems that Marx identified in 1848 continue in varied and increasing forms to 2020. The word society refers to pretty much everything: family, work, education, politics, which of course inform and create our relationship with ourselves. Marx's critique of society and the increasing relevance of his ideas show that we live in a society that creates broken families, unfulfilling jobs, problematic educational institutions, corrupt political regimes, and depressed and suicidal people. The very foundations for leading a meaningful life have been cracked and broken, and the emotional bonds that help us live with being broken in soul have become irreparably fractured. In modern times, Marx argues that this struggle exists between two classes of people. There are the people that work for a living and don't have much money and power, which Marx calls the proletariat. He defines this class as such. Because of the division of labor, the work of the proletariat has lost all of its individual character, and consequently, work has lost all of its attraction for the worker. The worker is just an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, the most monotonous work that is required of him. The other class of people have money and don't work that much, and Marx calls these people the bourgeois. The Communist Manifesto then shows how modern society hurts both the proletariat and the bourgeois, and Marx attempts to amend the emotional traumas of this system. Though this appears straightforward, and many of us can already find ourselves in some of these ideas, the ways that Marx draws these conclusions and the implications of these conclusions are traumatic and severe. Marx spent the rest of his life writing an unfinished 3-volume work called Capital to explain these conclusions, and because he ran out of time and died, no one truly understands Marx's proposed solutions. Yet his diagnoses are continually relevant, and Marx argues that the problem is called capitalism, which simply refers to an economic system that is founded upon the concept of capital, which is another word for profit, or surplus. Since profit is the foundation of every economic system, this makes capitalism hardly a new phenomenon, and in fact has been around for about 10,000 years since the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution laid the foundation for society as we know it today, and society always has the following attributes. Society is patriarchal, creates unequal levels in regards to economic situations, ethnicity, and gender, creates frustrating sexual relationships founded upon jealousy and insecurity, which we now call marriage, has disease, and starvation and war. All of these things are founded upon the concept of ownership. The agricultural revolution gave human beings an identity that is founded upon owning and dominating the physical world, from the land to food to each other. These are hallmarks of every human society that is founded upon agriculture to survive. Then a new era in history begins, called the Industrial Revolution, around the time that Marx is writing. With the invention of the steam engine and railroads, we could create, sell, and consume goods at rapidly increasing rates. The aim of the Industrial Revolution was, like the Agricultural Revolution, to further our dominance over the world in an effort to secure an easier physical life. With the ability to produce goods faster and cheaper, we could lessen food shortages, help give people safer living situations, and ideally, make our physical lives easier. However, like the agricultural revolution, the so-called advancement and progress of the Industrial Revolution had many unintended consequences. Marx reveals the emotional impact of modern society, which is important because it's almost impossible to see the unique aspects of the society in which we are born and raised. For example, nowadays we hear the words unprecedented and uncertain times, yet the emotional state of the coronavirus shutdowns is a defining quality of modern life, not an anomaly and not unprecedented. Marx writes 150 years ago, constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of the social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish modern times from all earlier times. Marx points out that the most unique part of the society in which we live is that capitalism values people only for their economic worth, and the more meaningful qualities of a person, their ability to be a good mother, a person's relationship to their religion, a thoughtful and thorough education, are ignored and even belittled. For example, the US gives new mothers only several months of maternity leave. The US has no cultural nor religious identity, and the American educational system is seen mostly as a way to advance one's career. Capitalism takes away the ways human beings once found meaning, such as tradition, political systems, religion, ancestral history, and culture. In place of these things, economic and social value is our main motivation. Marx should interest us because he examines the social system in which we live, and American capitalism is much more exaggerated than the form of capitalism which Marx studied. Capitalism, which has become synonymous with modern society, on the surface is marked by many improvements over past society. It aims at equality, democracy, and individual freedom, which were not explicit concerns of society prior to the French and American revolutions in the 18th century. On the other hand, capitalism is marked by deeply embedded social problems, such as suicide, homelessness, drug use, meaninglessness, self-harm, and ironically, equality and political apathy. Marx examines the relationship between the idealistic aims of society, equality, democracy, and freedom, and the inevitable consequences of this modern idealism, such as inequality, poverty, and depression. The Communist Manifesto is a short pamphlet written to inspire revolution. These ideas are complicated and poetic, yet Marx acutely critiques two main problems of modern life and modern society: the loss of culture and the destruction of family, which modern society achieves through exploitation, commodification, objectification, false conscience, and alienation. Thus, if you feel lonely, isolated, depressed, and betrayed by the world, you are not alone. These are defining traits of modern society. Marx's first problem with modern society is the weakening of cultural identity. Instead of local roots in a particular culture, modern society gives us a broader, less specific, and less meaningful cultural identity. In his own words, he writes, national differences and antagonisms between people are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeois, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production, and in the corresponding conditions of life. In short, economic advancement weakens national and cultural identity. Culture, a word that's tossed around endlessly these days, is a set of rituals, social gatherings, family relationships, literature, and religion that helps a person understand and live with pain. If you have questions about your difficult family background, struggle with feelings of meaninglessness, don't understand your family's religious background, or feel like you have no roots or have lost your connection to your family's history, you only need to look to the US's tremendous economy for answers. The connection between economic advancement and the loss of identity is as follows. The economy is structured around efficiency in transportation, communication, and production of goods. If the cost of production and transportation of goods is cheaper, goods can be sold at a cheaper price to more people, resulting in more profit. The more profit that a company and a city and nation has, the better the economy becomes, the more jobs, the more opportunities, and supposedly, the easier life becomes. However, as we become more effective in communication and the transportation and production of goods, we become less connected not only to the things we sell, but more importantly, less connected to each other. We spend more time with a greater number and greater variety of people, but have fewer meaningful relationships. But efficiency of economy is even more problematic than that. A strong cultural identity is founded upon exclusion. For example, to have a strong identity as a black person is to see yourself as distinct, separate, and unique from a white person, and vice versa. This cultural identity was once preserved in strong, local family and community relationships. The need to preserve community or family relationships was unnecessary, simply because it was very difficult to travel or communicate with other people. The current emphasis on community and family values is indicative of having lost these same values. Yet, as Marx notes, it is economically advantageous to erase the boundaries between cultures. As these boundaries are erased, we are forced to entertain artwork, histories, philosophies, and perspectives that are not only foreign to us, but are actually offensive to our own culture. The decreased antagonisms between cultures is not an aim as we see it today, but a byproduct which we value because it results in economic wealth. We embrace diversity not because it is emotionally and culturally beneficial, but because it economically benefits institutions. Diversity, especially as we understand it today, ends up in what Marx calls uniformity, marking not the advancement of culture, but the loss of culture, the loss of our ability to understand pain, and subsequent feelings of meaninglessness. The current popularity of profound existential questions is usually used as an attractive way to disguise a much more simple pain, whose main cause is the loss of culture, community, social relationships, and family history. Diversity and the loss of cultural boundaries is problematic because human beings can only accommodate a limited number of perspectives on life. These perspectives mostly correspond to our experiences, but more importantly correspond to the cultural philosophies that help us interpret and understand these experiences. If we have experiences for which our culture did not prepare us, or are encouraged to entertain cultural perspectives that don't correspond to our experiences, we get confused. Confusion simply means that we can no longer find a relationship between our emotions and our experiences, making it difficult to know which experiences we should invite into our lives and which we should avoid. For example, if your culture, such as the urban, modern culture, approaches sex and romantic relationships casually, the traditional idea of not having sex before marriage or feeling guilty for sex is nonsensical and insulting. However, if you come from a more traditional background, this cultural guilt is good, as it prevents you from acting upon the desire for sex that will result in immediate pleasure, but will ultimately make you less desirable and even less capable for marriage. If a person tries to accommodate both the modern and the traditional approach to sex and relationships, then we feel both guilt and pleasure for our desires for casual sex and a steady relationship. Unable to get rid of either the desire for pleasure or the guilt that comes from the desire for pleasure, we get confused. In short, we are given too many perspectives on the facet of life called sex and romance, and unable to commit ourselves to either approach, we become guilty about a fundamental need in life, which is a romantic partner. Many of the problems and questions that arise today come from too many perspectives, or experiences for which our culture has not prepared us. Cultures have distinct and exclusive perspectives in regards to marriage, language, family, and even religion, and other substantial lives, and a distinct cultural identity is necessary to have a life that doesn't have too much pain. Yet the intense focus on economic growth, which began in Europe and has since spread across the world, forced us to sacrifice our culture, history, and identity in order to have relationships with people who offend the ways that we understand and anticipate the unavoidable pain of being human, Marx writes. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the modern society over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeois has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every society. All long-established national industries have been destroyed or are being destroyed. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have commerce in every direction, a universal interdependence of nations. This again was written over 150 years ago, meaning several generations ago, specifically in an American context, we sacrificed local and national identity for what Marx calls a cosmopolitan character, which we now call diversity. Economic pursuits have long replaced differences between cultures in the modern world, instead causing most relationships to be based upon the most vulgar commonalities. Cross-cultural relationships are meaningful as long as they are based on economic pursuits and corresponding passing or shallow questions, conversations, and life pursuits. But once difficult emotions or difficult experiences arise, these relationships, lacking roots, fracture. Relationships are founded upon a mutual understanding of pain, and each culture has different pains and lives with pain in a different way. This problem is inescapable, as it is as difficult to recover a cultural identity that was lost several generations ago as it is, for an example, for an American to understand a Middle Eastern identity. An example of this is seen in people that immigrate to America from what is called the Third World. Most immigrants make no attempt to integrate into American culture and language for anything besides economic reasons. Yet their children, whom we call second-generation immigrants, have tremendous difficulty belonging either to the American or to their parents' cultures. Marx shows us that the American problems of equality and diversity are much more complicated than merely changing policies or adjusting institutional perception of non-male genders in non-white communities. Efforts to use the concepts of diversity and equality to reinvigorate cultural and emotional well-being often falter and are confused with embracing diversity and encouraging equality in regards to economic well-being. This distinction is important, considering that intense focus on economic well-being created the crises in emotional well-being. For example, when talking about gender equality, we point to the statistic that women on average make 80 cents for every dollar that a man makes. And when talking about equality for ethnicity, we mention that black and minority communities are disadvantaged because of being discriminated against in regards to employment, mortgages, and educational opportunities that result in higher salaries. But one of the many problems of defining equality in terms of economic worth is that economic prosperity often comes at the expense of emotional, social, and cultural well-being. The more modern culture aims at economic well-being, even economic equality, the more we ignore the complicated social and cultural distinctions that are necessary for emotional well-being. The best example of this is the Bay Area in the past decade, specifically the dramatic economic explosion that we've seen. Though many American cities and countries around the world envy the Bay Area's economy, the result is gentrification, the current term for economic well-being replacing cultural well-being. Because a company must now compete not only nationally, but globally to survive. Economic equality means living and working and building relationships in an environment that reflects the modern, universal culture. Roughly translated, this means that a person can only access economic equality if they sacrifice their own local and individual culture. Corporations are not the only places that erase culture. In the modern environment, universities, nonprofits, churches, grocery stores, hospitality industries have all become culturally universalized in order to survive economically. Thus, access to economic equality and the emphasis on economic prosperity leads to a loss of culture and a loss of meaning. This loss of shared history and the loss of culture leads to the inability to understand pain, leads to the breakdown of social relationships and general feelings of loneliness and worthlessness. It is difficult to function well in a corporatized education or sterile business environment in such an emotional state of worthlessness, making the loss of culture also the loss of the ability to succeed financially or socially. By emphasizing economic equality and opportunities, modern culture socially and emotionally weakens those who are already culturally confused, come from difficult social backgrounds, or whose values differ from the values of the universal, economically driven culture. This is one of the many complicated reasons why, though modern society has progressed more than any other society in terms of equality of economic opportunity, there continues to be and will continue to be significant inequalities in terms of emotional well-being, and consequently, economic well-being. This emphasis on economic equality, though well-intentioned, perpetuates economic inequality. All of this is well known to many non-white modern philosophers, such as Gandhi and Lame Deer. But in a modern American context, the black philosopher Malcolm X argued that American integration and American definitions of equality will weaken, not benefit, black communities. When the lines between cultures are blurred in marriages, business relationships, and schools, our cultural identity weakens. Instead, Malcolm X's religious organization, the Nation of Islam, created communities where businesses and schools catered exclusively to black communities. This is not an argument in support of racism. Obviously, tolerance between cultures is an extremely valuable goal, but is a goal that is as difficult as it is valuable. In fact, much of the racism and violence that characterizes modern America comes from the widespread feelings of meaninglessness and loneliness, which in turn has its roots in the loss of cultural boundaries. Yet these ideas have, for the most part, lost popularity in the 21st century, and the concepts of universal equality have replaced the concept of exclusionary communities and cultures, because as Marx anticipated, cities, companies, and even cultures must adopt the values of universal culture to compete and survive. Businesses or schools can't survive if they serve a unique culture set of values and beliefs. But even more tragically, because self-worth in the universal culture is largely dependent upon economic worth, we feel cultural shame and guilt unless we belong to a globally recognized institution, if only because it is difficult to be employed unless you belong to such an institution. Institutional identity has replaced cultural identity. Perhaps Jesus was a Marxist when he claims in the Gospel of Mark, "What good is it to gain the whole world, yet lose your soul?" The second effect of capitalism is the destruction of family. Though Marx identified this problem in 1848, the loss of close, meaningful family relationships continues to escalate. The generation who are now slowly entering adulthood is the first generation in human history to come from small, predominantly broken homes. Modern culture creates most of the psychological problems that characterize this generation, such as depression and anxiety. And yet a psychological problem, by definition, is the result of problematic experiences or biological abnormality. Yet Marx and other sociologists from the 19th century show us that though the manifestation of these emotional difficulties is psychological, the origin is the structure of modern society. This both liberates us and condemns us. It is liberating because instead of blaming individuals for negative experiences or blaming ourselves for being psychologically and physically inadequate for life, our only crime is simply being born into the modern era. At once, this is liberating, but this is also condemning us, because as we've said already, it's extremely difficult to recover a cultural identity that has been lost several generations ago. It's impossible to extricate ourselves from the effect of society. Because family and community are often romanticized these days, it should be stated that family and community are essentially a group of problematic people to whom you are forever socially and biologically obligated. Yet, just because something is problematic doesn't mean that we should just leave it behind. Though needs and desires and demands change as we pass through various stages of life, humans need social foundations, which makes most problematic family relationships generally more psychologically beneficial than a life spent entirely alone, or a life based on passing, fleeting relationships. Though humans are good at adapting to any environment, even solitude, we are at heart social animals. Unfortunately, not only does modernity give us difficult backgrounds, but it also places the burden of heavy decisions upon our shoulders, asking us to anticipate our future when we still don't understand our past. This is an unfair and difficult position for us to be in regards to our family backgrounds. Marx shows us how our difficult backgrounds are created. First, with the advancement of transportation and communication, it becomes not only easy to leave, but desirable and necessary to leave permanent and obligatory family relationships in favor of less substantial relationships that we easily leave behind. Marx poetically writes, "All firm relationships with their ancient and venerable prejudices are swept away. All new-formed relationships become old even before they can become solid. All that is solid melts into the air. All that is holy becomes profaned." Where once we came only into contact with our families and extended families, with advancements in communication and transportation, we now have many new-formed, as Marx states, relationships, but few meaningful, lasting, permanent relationships. In our constant quest for the desires that modern culture creates, like love, happiness, and social success, we learn to live independently, not because independence is desirable, but merely out of necessity. In this environment, we learn that other people aren't looking for meaningful relationships, and we ourselves don't have the psychological or social supports that are necessary to build long-lasting relationships. Marx didn't live to see Facebook or live to see the airplane, but he didn't need to meet Mark Zuckerberg to anticipate the studies that conclusively link social media to depression and anxiety. Modern psychologists are studying the emotional impact of these advancements in communication, technology, and travel, yet Marx reveals that the root of these problems is the aspects of society that we generally categorize as progress and advancement. Secondly, these advancements in communication and travel necessitate and create shifting modes of production, which in turn necessitate a migration from the country to the city. Marx writes, "The bourgeois has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population in comparison to the rural." But as we become more concentrated in cities, instead of working and living and eating in large rural communities, we live in small, socially isolated environments which become more and more isolated as the generations pass. Modern folks are raised by two parents who they themselves have to work, and extended family is reserved for holidays. Rural communities and rural economies have been ruined, and the shifts to the city result in inflation and tremendous spikes in the cost of living, forcing us to spend most of our time working just to pay rent. City life exaggerates the need for social status, because it is economically beneficial for people to be in search of something that can't be satisfied, like the high opinion of others. The combination of competition and a busy, fast-paced life makes it almost impossible to create meaningful relationships at work or school, especially in contrast to the communities that once defined human life. Community now becomes a buzzword that not only bears no resemblance to its true meaning, but furthermore is used as a slogan to keep employees and students on good terms with each other so that institutions can be profitable, keeping in mind that metropolitan institutions are the very things which originally destroyed community. The advancement of transportation, communication, and the migration to large cities has destroyed families, because meaningful relationships are economically inefficient. Families are continually fractured just in order to survive increasing economic demands. Marx writes, "Modern society has torn the sentimental veil away from the family and reduced the family relation to a mere money relation." Since the economy went from a local to a national to a global phenomenon, even so-called third world countries are losing traditional social relationships in order to survive economically. Third world is a derogatory term used to describe economically undeveloped place where no one talks about family and community because they haven't lost it yet. Marx writes, "Modern society, by the rapid movement of all the instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of production, draws all nations into civilization. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the modern mode of production. In one word, it creates a world after its own image." Because of the increased demands of things like medicine, oil, and technology, a nation must be globally competitive to survive. Thus, not only is the global economy erasing local identities to create a universal culture, the isolation of modern individualism is spreading as well. Aristotle opens his famous book on the social nature of man called Politics by claiming, "A person who lives alone is either a god or a beast," and it is obvious in which direction we are headed. When people come from the third world to the modern world, or if our great-grandparents could live to see our current family relationships, friendships, and marriages, I am sure they wouldn't applaud us on becoming gods. This is all extremely depressing, but the only criminal is human nature. As Epicurean philosophy notes, our pain is usually created by our pleasure, and we live in a time with the greatest pleasures, eases, and conveniences, things that humanity has desired for thousands of years. Rumi, the Persian philosopher, once claimed that proof of God is when your prayers are not answered, because most of the things that we want will only serve to hurt us. As our prayers for technological and economic advancement come true, we regress socially and emotionally. Though loneliness has always been a quality of human life, Marx explains how it is now being suffered in ways that will increase social illnesses, which translate to violence, divorce, and sexual abuse, obvious qualities of modern life. Marx points to the fact that though we ourselves may suffer from these illnesses, or have or will suffer at the hands of these illnesses, there are no criminals, just an increasingly broken society. These two things, the weakening of cultural identity and the destruction of the family, occur through three attributes of capitalism: exploitation, commodification, alienation, and false conscience. It's four attributes of capitalism. Exploitation is a fairly straightforward concept, and it's most obvious in the way that the upper classes treat the lower classes. The lower classes are given wages that are only a portion of the worth of the goods that they produce, and the rest of the money, the profit, goes to the people that already have money, like those who own property, the administrators, and the management. For example, if you work as a cook, you make minimum wage, but each dish that you make is sold to a stranger for about 5 times of what you're paid to make this dish. The social worth of a person, which is defined by the profit of the goods that they produce, is taken by people who had no part in producing the goods. This is the exploitation of the lower classes, which happens at every level, in every working environment, from education to healthcare to hospitality. It becomes more exaggerated as a company or as an institution expands, which is necessary for a company to survive because profit, as Marx notes, by its very nature is unstable. And in order for a company to thrive, the profits which the workers produce goes to the expansion of the business instead of the workers. The lower classes are told that this expansion will benefit them, and in the short term it does in the form of small wage increases. But as a company grows, the workers become more and more isolated from the profits, isolated from the customers, and isolated from the goods that they themselves produce. And the people who originally had money make more money, while having less and less to do with the actual production of goods. You can see this if, for example, um, you work at a local restaurant versus working at Carl Jr.'s, if you work at Safeway or Lucky's versus working at a local grocery store. The lower classes in a capitalistic environment are told that if they work hard, they too can become upper class. And though technically feasible, in realistic terms, this is a lie that is told to encourage the lower classes to participate in companies, institutions, and businesses where the further they advance, the more they'll be exploited. This leads us to Marx's true genius, which is to show that the upper classes are exploited as well. Marx pities the way that the upper classes are forced to worship money, and Marx argues that in a capitalistic environment, the desire for social advancement becomes an inescapable addiction. Yet, as somebody rises in society and becomes more financially successful, their life becomes more isolated, more busy, and their identity rests more upon belonging to a system which obviously hurts people and contributes and creates social illnesses. As your value increases in a system that concerns itself only with technological and economic advancement at the expense of emotional and social well-being, our fears of being exploited, our cynicism, and general meaninglessness increase as well. The better your job is, the better the university that you attend, the more money you make, the more your identity and self-worth will be confused and isolated, which will make it more difficult to live a meaningful life. It becomes more difficult to define the parts of you that belong to you and the parts of you which are being used and forgotten by society. Exploitation happens through what Marx calls commodification. Commodification is when the value of a person and their work is dependent upon their economic worth. In other words, you are only as valuable to society insofar as you can benefit institutions and the economy. One of the best examples of this is art, because art, by definition, speaks to your emotions. and lets you know that you're more than your body, more than your mind, more than your past, more than your future, and more than your wallet. In short, art is supposed to remind you that you have a soul, and nothing is more economically useless than your soul. However, in the capitalistic environments, art inherently has no economic value unless it's popular, because when it's unpopular, it can become embedded in various economic systems, from advertisements to live performances. Because the value of art is dependent upon its ability to become popular, art appeals to the most universal and cheapest human desires, like sex and self-pity. Since creating unique, beautiful art that lasts a long time is economically disadvantageous, we make art and material goods that are easily consumed and easily forgotten, thus creating an unquenchable thirst for something that we can't name. Another name for this is depression. Thus, a worker's economic livelihood is dependent upon their ability to cheapen their life, their work, and thus the lives of the people that use these goods. Commodification makes it so that a person's values rests not on their ability to be a good husband, wife, mother, or father, or artist, but instead how well they can do things that will become popular and make money. In contrast, in many parts of the Middle East, there are no copyright laws, which makes it so that there is no ownership or economic benefit to art. This, of course, creates economic chaos, which is a defining quality of the Middle East. But it also means that someone won't cheapen their artistic talents just to appeal to the masses, become popular, and financially successful. To go even further back in history, in many Native American conceptions of art, the artist doesn't sign their name on their work, because they conceived of themselves merely as a vehicle for the spirit of creation. Similar examples of this can be found in Greek mythology and Hindu scriptures. But instead of viewing the act of creation as something sacred, creation is now valued only so far as it is economically beneficial. Since cheap goods are easily commodified, our worth as human beings is defined, again, by our ability to make cheap, meaningless goods. Commodification happens through what Marx calls objectification. Objectification is where society values you not as a human being, but as a tool to benefit the economy, and we in turn value people only for how useful they are to us. Objectification is not a new concept, as Aristotle in the 5th century BC called this sort of relationship a friendship of utility. In general, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to see people as more than reflections of our own desires and insecurities, or to see people more than as means to satisfy ourselves financially, physically, or emotionally. However, objectification changes under capitalism and becomes even more deeply rooted in our psyche. The things that we want from other people as well become even more vulgar, in the sense that since society values us for our capacity to help the economy, we consequently value people more for their ability to advance our career, to help us on our test, or in other ways, satisfy or advance us socially. Objectification is not only pertaining to valuing people for economic benefit, but it also occurs in other significant aspects of life, again, in romance and sex. As usual, whenever anything goes wrong in the world, it is women who always suffer the negative consequences, and in a capitalistic environment, we are not encouraged to see women as potential wives or mothers, daughters and sisters, but rather as objects for sex. Marx even claims that we embrace equality of gender not because it is inherently desirable, but rather because it benefits the economy. He writes, "Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor." Thus, women, who have long been considered sacred because of their ability to create humans, if you just think about that for a moment, your entire life and emotions and everything about you was created by your mother. Instead of this sacred creation, women, like art, are objectified and valued instead for their ability to become an industry. Sex, as one of the most powerful forces in life, goes from being the foundation of everything sacred to being the most profitable industry. We see this in movies and music that's produced, the clothing that is popular, and even things seemingly as benign as advertisements and children's cartoons. Pornography is one of the biggest industries in America, and one economics professor even argued that pornography is more financially profitable than Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Yahoo combined. And because of these internalized demands of society, women, if they want to be seen as successful by society, are encouraged to value themselves not for their social and emotional worth as girlfriends, mothers, and wives, or intellectual or emotional worth as artists or philosophers, but for their physical and sexual worth. Outwardly and inwardly, women are objectified and see themselves and have others see them as a sexual product. Objectification affects men, to a lesser extent for many reasons, mostly because we never had the ability to create and thus didn't have much to offer or lose to begin with. Though all of this is devastating for women's self-worth, insecurity has tremendous economic benefits, since insecure people are more likely to buy things that promise to increase social worth. These products deliver on this promise by successfully hypersexualizing women, which was the original cause of the insecurity. All of this is done with the modern language of freedom, self-expression, and democracy. Through objectification, modern society turns everything, including women, into a product. We are sold physically, sold sexually, and sold socially, and when we're no longer attractive to society, we are ignored and isolated. You are valuable only so far as you're economically beneficial. Because people who have self-worth don't buy things, capitalism exaggerates the most meaningless parts of human life, causing us to value ourselves and value other people for humiliating things, like money, sexual worth, and the different ways that we are encouraged to worship ourselves. Though of course we still need to buy things, capitalism encourages to buy things that we don't need or even want. All of this makes meaningful relationships and having a meaningful life things that were always difficult, almost impossible. Now, who would participate in a system like this? If capitalism in modern society is so bad, who perpetuates the system? And the answer to this question is you. And you participate in this system and perpetuate this system because of your self-delusions, which Marx calls false conscience. False conscience is the psychological complement to an ideology, and is based in our longing to be accepted, to be seen, and to be loved, which allows us to believe the self-images that society gives us, even though in modern times, these self-images serve only to humiliate us. False conscience allows our identities to be rooted in institutions rather than our own individual cultures, causing us to value our relationship with our jobs more than our relationships with our families and communities. Our conscience is the most foundational aspect of our identity, as it is the source of our guilt and pride, shame and joy. In the most dramatic sense, Socrates' conscience, as seen in the Apology, belongs to something called a daimon, which is the spirit that sends messages from God to Socrates. This is similar to the Holy Spirit in Christian philosophy or the angel Gabriel, Jibril, in Islamic philosophy. After delivering an earth-shattering speech that exhibits only contempt for the Athenian court, Socrates was assured that his actions and speech were good because his daimon did not indicate otherwise. Plato was the first philosophy, again in the 5th century BC, to develop the concept of happiness, calling it eudaimonia, eu meaning good and daimon, which means spirit. Thus, in its original meaning, happiness is found only when your conscience is able to submit to the will of God. This early form of happiness can also be found in the opening lines of the Sermon on the Mount, called the Beatitudes, which is Latin for happiness, in which Jesus lists the things that bring happiness, such as poverty, mourning, hunger, meekness, and thirst. This early definition of happiness is keeping in mind that Socrates, in the 36 books that Plato wrote about him, nor Jesus, in the over 50 Gospels that we now have, neither Socrates nor Jesus neither smiled nor laughed, and both were publicly ridiculed and then murdered by the people that were trying to educate. This was the original conception of happiness. But modern society creates a conscience that belongs to economic development. Thus, concepts such as happiness and romance are portrayed in a way to make us good consumers, which first encourages us to think that we deserve more than what we or what others have been given. Capitalism in modern society gives us an exaggerated sense of self-worth, making us arrogant and conceited, which makes it so that in the moments when we are no longer useful to society, or in moments of honest reflections, the most traumatic psychological state arises in us, which is an undying sense of self-pity. Through this false conscience, we believe that those in power or the institutions themselves care for us, which allows us to be exploited, commodified, and objectified, and more importantly, forces us to exploit, commodify, and objectify others. False conscience is analogous to Malcolm X's concept of the house slave, but instead of talking about our self-delusions in terms of race and ethnicity, Marx discusses these delusions in terms of economics. Malcolm X's concept of a house slave describes a black person who, through living in a white environment and through the small favors and compliments of a white person, is separated from their culture and seeks the acceptance of white culture instead of black culture. Likewise, Marx shows us that the pleasures that come from being objectified overwhelm and then eliminate our ability and even desire to become human. Both concepts result in us begging to be loved by people and systems who view us as less than human. Yet both Malcolm X and Marx give us hope, imploring us to become, in Malcolm X's term, a field slave, and in Marx's term, a species self, or to become a person who is willing to suffer and even enjoy suffering in the quest to live and die as a genuine human being, seeking honesty as opposed to the values and opinions of others who genuinely don't care much about us. No one who knows their true worth will ever allow themselves to be exploited, used, or objectified. Remember in the Apology when Socrates claims it's better to die on your feet than live on your knees? If such a life was difficult 2,500 years ago in Athens, the modern world has made it all but impossible to live in ways that respect philosophies that are meant to help us become human. To conclude Marx's diagnoses of capitalism, Marx is one of the last philosophers to discuss the relationship between the economy, the quality of society, and our psychological well-being, all with beautiful language that is rooted in universal philosophical questions. In the 19th century, education was divided into different disciplines such as sociology, psychology, philosophy, and advancement in each of these disciplines now demands a particular focus on a specific aspect of one discipline. But Marx ties these fields together, showing us that a society that is primarily interested in economic pursuits creates a psychological state which he calls alienation. Alienation means that we live in a society where everyone is strangers to each other, but even more problematic, we are strangers to ourselves. Life in capitalism is a lonely, isolated experience with few meaningful social relationships, made even more traumatic because capitalism promises possibilities that were never previously conceived in society, like social mobility, individual freedom, and global democracy. All of this makes it so that if a person feels depressed, used, or culturally alienated, capitalism tells you that because it offered you opportunities, your feelings of failure, isolation, and depression is a result of your own personal shortcomings. This loneliness is all the more ironic because it happens within the context of big cities, where people are physically close to one another, but emotionally distant. If Marx's critiques of capitalism are disturbing, his proposals to fix society are terrifying, as they show how far we are from a society that will live up to its ideals and create a meaningful life through these ideals. Marx's solution to these social illnesses are complicated and controversial, and the attempted implementation of these solutions has created some of the most corrupt regimes and broken economic systems. Yet Marx's proposed solutions show us the steps that are necessary to achieve things that we currently uncritically accept as good and attainable, such as economic equality, the revitalization of communities, and universal happiness. There are two approaches to fix the illnesses of modern society. The first is to understand social illnesses by comparing the current structure of societies to social structures that encourage a meaningful life, either traditional structures that have been in place for thousands of years or idealized structures. The latter approach to the idealized structures is seen, for example, in Plato's Republic, a massive work of philosophy that shows the relationship between one's soul and the society in which they live. The second approach in fixing society is to instead use advances in society to fix the problems of the same society. Modern social and political philosophy chooses the second path, mostly because progress is a central part of the modern narrative. However, it is also impossible and even undesirable to revert to previous forms of society, if only because the population is expanding so drastically that we need the current modes of production simply to support the population. Marx, as a modern European philosopher, tries to use these advances in society to fix society. And though he laid the foundation for many positive changes to the workforce since 1848, such as minimum wage, child labor laws, and the weekend, not the musical group, but the thing that happens on Saturday and Sunday, the isolating and alienating impacts of capitalism continue to increase. Marx was influenced by a French utopian philosophy, Scottish economic theory, and English political theory. Yet the heart of Marx's philosophy is German idealism, specifically a philosopher named Hegel. Hegel, roughly speaking, argued that human history is progressing, and society and humans in the world in general is constantly improving. Though at our most generous there are significant problems with this philosophy of history, the notion of history is seen not only in our history textbooks, but also in the way that we understand science, education, and society and psychology, even society, and also the ways that we currently understand race and gender relations. The notion of progress is so wired into modern culture that the idea is rarely critiqued or even understood as a unique quality of modern European philosophy. In other words, the notion of progress is a white idea, an ideology used in part to show that white cultures, because our social and technological advancements, are better than backwards, less advanced third world cultures. In contrast, there is not a single ancient philosopher from Confucius to Plato to Augustine that views the entirety of human history as progressing in a positive way. Polytheistic philosophies such as Hindu and Greek religions conceived of history as cyclical, and this can be seen in the rise and fall of cities and civilizations that resemble those of modern times. Monotheistic philosophy, in contrast, such as Christianity, Islam, and Zoroastrianism, in fact conceive of history as a steady decline, which culminates in evil forces overwhelming good forces, leading to the destruction of the world, the apocalypse, and then the resurrection of souls. This places Marx and us in an awkward position. He first argues that the things that we imagine to be good about society, such as our technological advancement and physical safety, cause the things that are horrible about our society, such as depression and loneliness. Yet Marx doesn't conceive of history as a series of structural revolutions such as the Agricultural Revolution, French Revolution, Protestant Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution, each of which has radically shifted the way that we see ourselves and others, and each of which has made it progressively more difficult in their own ways to lead a meaningful life. Instead, Marx wants to use the benefits of each revolution to fix the negative consequences of the same revolution. For example, in regards to the agricultural revolution, he wants to keep the concept of agriculture, but eliminate the negative psychological consequences of agriculture, such as the jealousy and insecurity that ownership creates. Marx aims to create an equal and fair society, where everyone has access to the same physical and emotional resources. He argues that we should use these advances in society to fix the broken foundations of modern culture. Though these aims are now accepted uncritically, the route towards equality is dramatic and violent. He proposes a revolution that will result in the elimination of private property, as well as the elimination of cultural and family boundaries. The steps that are necessary to achieve equality are startling, yet as far as we know are the only ways to fix the inequality and emotional traumas that define society after the agricultural revolution. These solutions also explain why, despite sincere and widespread social movements such as the Occupy movement and the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020, various forms of inequality and increasing varieties of emotional sicknesses continue to define our world. To begin with, Marx demands nothing less than a revolution. If anyone identifies themselves as a Marxist, know that they are interested in nothing in just a revolution. This is not revolution in terms of Bernie Sanders' revolution, such as changes in policies, but a revolution in the more traditional sense, such as killing everyone who opposes your cause. Believing that the upper classes are so lost in their false conscience and will never relinquish their privilege to benefit the poor, Marx argues that the upper classes can be freed of their delusions only if they are murdered. Though optimistic in regards to change in society, Marx did not have an optimistic philosophy of education. He writes, "There is only one way in which the murderous death agonies of the old society and the bloody birth throes of the new society can be shortened, simplified and concentrated, and that way is revolutionary terror. The aim of this revolutionary terror and the aim of this revolution is the elimination of private property. Profits, capital, or surplus involves buying things cheaply and selling these same things at a higher price with the intent of increasing personal wealth. This leads Marx to correctly conclude that profit by definition is unethical because it involves taking things from the poor and then giving them to the rich. The concept of profit is the origin of all inequality. All social injustice is the result of personal ownership, and both surplus and ownership are defining qualities of society since the agricultural revolution. Once profits and private property are eliminated, Marx argues, economic and racial inequality and all other differences in class division will also disappear, and society will be equal and fair. The result of this elimination of private property is the elimination of family and cultural boundaries. Though Marx shows how the deterioration of family and culture make us alienated to each other, alienated to our pasts, and alienated to ourselves, he does not want to resurrect communities and family values. Instead, true to his philosophy of history, he shows that family and cultural boundaries are the cause of pre-modern social illnesses, such as war and famine. Instead, he argues that families and culture are not compatible with equality. Once private property is abolished, family ties will no longer be necessary, and inequality, and social illnesses will likewise be eradicated. These solutions, which are the core of communism, are just as correct as they are unrealistic. Marx and communism are unrealistic because they argue that we can fix society. Before Marx, philosophy pointed us inward, telling us that social inequality is inevitable, as it is an externalization of the psychological conflicts inherent in human life. Should we want equality in society, we should first have balance within ourselves, and express this balance in our personal relationships, which, in turn, will be reflected in society. In contrast, Marx and most of modern philosophy pushes us outward, calling us to focus on societal reform as opposed to psychological balance and maturity. The past 150 years have also shown us that these reforms are far too ambitious, as Marx wants to correct 10,000 years of human history. Though he may be accurate in his assessment of the emotional problems of a society exclusively driven by the economy, it is difficult to live by the standards of our grandparents' generation, let alone the standards of pre-agricultural societies. The gap that separates the illnesses of modern society and the cure to these illnesses is insurmountable, and like most lofty ambitions, attempts to bridge this gap may only result in a poisonous cynicism and a dangerous apathy. Even worse, a close reading of Marx's solutions may lead us to accuse other people or even the very nature of society for the personal problems that modernity creates for us. A more modest and realistic approach to Marx is not to fundamentally change the structure of society, but rather to rid ourselves of the exaggerated ambitions of modern capitalism, which often creates a dramatic combination of arrogance and worthlessness. The historical failures of Marxism is not the failure of all social reform, but perhaps compels us to be more modest in the ways that we help those who are suffering needlessly in our own lives and in our own communities. Marx's critiques and the failure of his ideas call us to live more modest lives, where our meaning comes from our cultural and family histories, as broken and hurtful as these may appear to be. Identifying the ways in which we personally have been deluded and isolated by our own arrogance and ambition may be more useful than attempting to reform qualities of society that have existed since the ancient Egyptians. At the very least, we should live lives of which our grandparents would be proud, where we are neither beasts nor gods, but normal people who unfortunately have to work exceptionally hard to achieve the basics of an emotionally satisfying life. Marx calls us to quit objectifying, quit commodifying, and quit exploiting ourselves, to quit valuing ourselves for things that other people can take from us, and instead value ourselves for our ability to give others the stability and security that we find within ourselves. Marx dreams of a utopian society that can counter the negative consequences of the Industrial Revolution. Yet happiness, the acceptance of death, and submission to life is reserved for the rare, the Socrateses and the Malcolm X's. The rest of us are eternal beginners, struggling through each new stage that life forces us to encounter. Yet the idealism of the 21st century is loftier than Marx's utopia, and our dreams of happiness, romance, secularism, and individuality are frequently shattered by the undeniable realities of the modern world, many of which are caused by advancements in technology. Society is changing more dramatically and more rapidly in ways that we won't understand for a long time. This combination of idealism and social problems makes Marx's critique of the modern world continually relevant. The severe steps that Marx lays out to achieve these modern ideals also cause us to be wary of blindly following social movements, irrespective of political party that, in name, serve economic development or equality, but in substance, further alienate and separate people from one another. Regarding these challenges that Marx poses to us, and the ways that Marx has historically been used and is currently used, perhaps this can be said. Towards the end of his life, one of the first so-called Marxists, Karl Marx's son-in-law who married Marx's daughter, Jenny, wrote a piece of Marxist literature entitled The Right to Laziness. Marx, upon seeing the type of person who had married his daughter and what had become of his ideas after only one generation had passed, famously claimed, "If that's what a Marxist looks like, then I am not a Marxist." The great German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once claimed that the only true Christian died on the cross 2,000 years ago, and likewise, perhaps the first and last Marxist has also long since left us.